Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the pages of time. Tonight, we venture into a land of snow-covered steppes and golden onion domes, of poets and cosmonauts, emperors and revolutionaries, a place where history stretches vast and deep, like the mighty rivers that run through its soul. This is Russia. A land of contradictions and complexity, beauty and hardship. From the icy forests of Siberia to the palaces of St. Petersburg, from the legends of ancient Rus to the quiet dreams of today's children, Russia's story is one of endurance, imagination, and transformation. So settle in. Let your thoughts drift like snowflakes on a wintry breeze. We'll move slowly through 10 chapters of Russian history, each one a soft step deeper into the heart of this immense and fascinating land. There's no need to stay awake. Just listen, and let the stories carry you. This is Sleepy Time History, and our journey begins now. Long before the name Russia ever echoed through the valleys and over the steppes, the vast lands that would one day become the Russian Federation were already cradling the earliest footsteps of humankind. These ancient lands stretch from the icy tundras of Siberia to the dense forests of the West, from the towering peaks of the Caucasus to the wind-swept plains of the North. It is here, in this immense and varied landscape, that the story of Russia truly begins. Not with the clash of empires or the rise of Tsars, but with the quiet persistence of early humans seeking shelter, warmth, and life. Tens of thousands of years ago, during the Paleolithic period, small bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers roamed the Russian steppes. Archaeological discoveries, from bone tools in the Altai Mountains to the elaborate burial mounds in Kostenki along the Don River, reveal a world of creativity and survival. The people who dwelled here painted on cave walls, carved figurines, and followed the migratory paths of mammoth and reindeer, adapting to the bitter cold and the ever-changing natural world. Life was harsh, but these early communities endured, laying the first invisible stones of what would one day become a great nation. As the Ice Age slowly receded, rivers thawed and forests stretched across the land. With the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods came agriculture, pottery, and settlement. The fertile river valleys, especially around the Dnieper and the Volga, became cradles of early culture. Small villages appeared, their people planting grains, domesticating animals, and forming the first human networks that would connect the immense spaces of what we now call Russia. Around the 3rd millennium BCE, the Bronze Age brought new shifts. Cultures such as the Yamnaya and the Andronovo emerged, spreading their languages, customs, and technologies. These were horse riders, traders, and warriors, navigating the wind-swept grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. With bronze tools and chariots, they were able to expand across large distances, influencing other tribes and contributing to the great Indo-European language family that would spread across continents. In the forests and plains to the west, mysterious ancient peoples built earthworks and ceremonial sites, their rituals lost to time but their legacy buried in the soil. Meanwhile, in the Siberian taiga, reindeer herders and shamans passed down oral traditions beneath the swirling northern lights, stories carried by firelight and breath, never written down, but deeply rooted in spirit and memory. One of the most remarkable discoveries from this time is the Shigar idol, carved more than 9,000 years ago from larch wood and unearthed in the Ural Mountains. Towering over 5 meters tall, it bears strange, haunting geometric patterns and humanoid faces, silent witnesses to a belief system long vanished. It remains one of the oldest wooden artifacts in the world, a haunting, beautiful symbol of early imagination. Over the centuries, waves of new peoples would pass through these lands. Finno-Ugric tribes from the north, Scythian horsemen sweeping across the steppe, and Iranian-speaking nomads pushing in from the south. Each brought with them their own customs, languages, and ways of life, leaving subtle traces in the DNA, languages, and legends of future generations. In the Far East, along the Pacific coast, communities thrived that would later become the ancestors of the Chukchi and Evenki peoples. They fished in icy waters, hunted seals, and lived in harmony with the rhythms of the land and sea, their isolation preserving ancient ways even as the western steppe turned towards cities and states. By the end of the first millennium BCE, the threads of Russian prehistory had been woven into a complex and beautiful tapestry, one stitched with migrations, myths, and quiet innovations. This land of extremes, of fire and frost, forest and plain, had become a meeting ground for cultures. Though still without a name, without a crown, and without a flag, the heart of Russia had begun to beat. And as the stars turned over the vast, open skies, as frost painted patterns on birch bark, and the rivers flowed ever onward, something was stirring. The seeds of civilization were about to take root. But for now, let us remain in this ancient stillness, listening to the whisper of stone tools, the crackle of distant fires, and the timeless hush of wind moving gently across the steppe. Long before the rise of cities with stone walls and gleaming towers, the lands of early Russia were shaped by a fascinating blend of tribal customs, evolving technologies, and far-reaching trade. While not known for the kind of ancient monumental architecture seen in Egypt or Mesopotamia, the people of these territories nurtured rich and layered cultures, civilizations built not from stone, but from the rhythms of the earth, the sky, and the rivers. The first notable cultures to take root in what is now Russian territory include the Fatyanovo-Balanovo people of the forested west and the Khvalynsk culture near the lower Volga. These were among the early Indo-European speakers, tied closely to the Yamnaya horizon, who expanded across the Eurasian steppe from around 3300 BCE. They were skilled in metalworking, created pottery with distinctive shapes and patterns, and were among the first to harness the power of domesticated horses, a transformative step that allowed communities to move swiftly across vast plains. To the south, the Bronze Age Andronovo and later Karasuk cultures brought a blend of agriculture, metallurgy, and burial practices that signaled a more complex society. Kurgans, large burial mounds, dotted the steppe, holding the remains of warriors, elders, and leaders, often buried with weapons, ornaments, and livestock. These mound graves, still visible today in parts of southern Russia and Kazakhstan, tell stories of status, belief, and ancestral reverence. They are solemn hills of memory, marking the transition from tribe to something larger, perhaps the beginning of states. As time moved forward, the expansive steppe belt became a corridor for exchange and migration. Scythian nomads emerged in the first millennium BCE, galloping across the southern plains on horseback, their flowing garments catching the wind. These fierce and mysterious people were master horsemen, metalworkers, and archers. They adorned themselves with intricate gold jewelry, decorated with swirling animal motifs, leaping stags, snarling leopards, and fantastical creatures, blending artistry with symbolism and spirit. Despite their mobility, the Scythians were not isolated. They traded with Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast and with peoples as far east as China. From these coastal interactions came pottery, wine, and coins. In return, the Greeks received grain, hides, and the secrets of the steppe. The city of Olbia, a Greek colony near modern Ukraine, served as a bustling gateway to the interior, connecting two very different worlds. Alongside the Scythians were other tribal confederations such as the Sarmatians, a kindred but distinct group known for their warrior women, perhaps inspiring later tales like the Amazons. These horse-bound societies preserved oral traditions, revered sky gods, and maintained balance between the masculine and feminine within their clans. Their influence would ripple across Central Asia and even into Europe during times of migration. Further north, the Finno-Ugric peoples such as the Mari, Udmurt, and Komi occupied the dense taiga forests and river valleys. These groups, speaking languages unrelated to Indo-European tongues, lived in harmony with the natural world, worshipping spirits of water, tree, and sky. Their civilizations were not defined by conquest or architecture, but by resilience and spiritual depth, echoing through folk traditions and languages that still survive today in parts of Russia's interior. The Volga River, the great spine of Western Russia, became a lifeline of communication and exchange. Along its banks grew settlements that harvested grain, forged tools, and nurtured culture. The Ananyino culture of the first millennium BCE, for example, demonstrated early ironworking and a rich material culture in the Volga-Kama region. These people crafted elaborate belt buckles, weapons, and ceramics, and maintained complex burial rites, showing both craft and care for their dead. In the eastern reaches, near Lake Baikal and the Siberian highlands, cultures such as the Glazkov and Okhinev people practiced early shamanic rites. Petroglyphs etched into stone reveal horned figures, sun discs, and ritual scenes. These societies, tied to the rhythms of stars and seasons, remind us that civilization is not always measured in bricks or roads, but in the power of connection to Earth and cosmos. By the first few centuries BCE, some regions of southern Russia were absorbed into broader networks, whether the Greek and Roman worlds to the west, or the Chinese Han Empire to the east. Silk and amber, tin and silver, stories and myths all passed through this land. Though fragmented and diverse, the cultures that blossomed across early Russia were linked by movement, trade, and spirit. There were no grand pyramids here, no ziggurats reaching for the heavens. Instead, the civilizations of ancient Russia were woven into nature itself. In the steppe grasses, the icy rivers, the carved stones, and the winds that carried songs across great distances. As twilight falls on this segment of time, we begin to sense that a new chapter is drawing near, one where scattered tribes and trading settlements will eventually be pulled into something more unified, guided by rivers, fortified by forests, and sparked by contact with powerful neighbors to the south and west. But for now, let's rest here, in the hush of ancient fires, beside the winding Volga, beneath stars that watched over 1,000 quiet beginnings. As the ancient peoples of the Russian heartlands cultivated their own rhythms of life, herding, hunting, and trading along the vast rivers and open steppes, change began to stir on the distant frontiers. Slowly at first, then with growing intensity, waves of newcomers arrived, drawn by the land's expanse, its resources, and its potential for power. From the south, The first significant incursions came with the arrival of the Cimmerians and Scythians. Nomadic horse riders, both groups carved their way across the southern steppe during the first millennium BCE. Though they were not so much conquerors as they were fierce wanderers, their presence reshaped the political and cultural landscapes. The Scythians, in particular, left a legacy of art, warfare, and mythology that would echo in the centuries to follow. But the story of conquest in these lands is perhaps most vividly written in the first great collision of East and West, the Mongol invasion. In the early 13th century, under the unified banner of Genghis Khan and later his grandson Bata Khan, the Mongol Empire expanded westward with an unstoppable momentum. Their cavalry moved like shadows over the steppe, swift and silent, their arrows blotting out the sun. By 1237, the Mongols, known in Russian memory as the Tatars, swept into the principalities of Rus, laying waste to cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev with terrifying precision. What followed was nearly 2 centuries of domination by the Mongol Golden Horde, a rule not marked by total occupation, but by tribute and terror. Russian princes were allowed to retain their thrones, but only with the approval of the Khans. These local rulers would travel long distances to the horde's capital, bowing before Mongol overlords to receive their patents of authority. The Mongols rarely interfered with Orthodox Christianity or village life, but their grip was undeniable. Gold, grain, and loyalty flowed south to the horde, and in return, peace was granted. Fragile, but preferable to the fire that had come before. Yet even as the Mongols ruled, other invaders tested the western and northern borders. The Teutonic Knights, German crusaders cloaked in chainmail and crosses, launched campaigns into the Baltic frontier. In 1242, they met a formidable opponent in the Russian Prince Alexander Nevsky, who led his forces across the frozen expanse of Lake Peipus in a legendary clash known as the Battle on the Ice. With cunning and bravery, Nevsky repelled the invaders, securing the western lands and earning a lasting place in Russian legend. Meanwhile, from the northeast, the forested realms witnessed the gradual rise of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Though still under Mongol shadow, Moscow's princes began to grow in influence by acting as loyal tax collectors for the horde. Over time, however, that loyalty would sour, and Moscow would rise, not through outright rebellion at first, but through subtle consolidation of surrounding territories. The Mongol dominance, while brutal in its onset, brought surprising consequences. It spurred administrative reform, communication networks, and even influenced military organization. Russian cities began to build stronger defenses. Trade routes stretched further east. A peculiar fusion of Slavic resilience and Asian steppe influence began to take shape, a blend that would leave lasting marks on governance, culture, and military strategy. But the Mongols were not the only outside power to press against the Russian frontier. The Swedes to the northwest, the Lithuanians to the west, and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, each made their forays into the contested lands of Rus. Borders shifted like wind-blown snow, alliances were forged and broken, and cities fell under one flag only to rise under another. Even the Norse had left their mark earlier, sailing down the rivers in sleek longboats, establishing trade routes and settlements. Known to the Slavs as the Varangians, these Scandinavian adventurers, warriors and merchants alike, helped shape the foundations of early Rus. One such figure, Rurik, is credited with founding the dynasty that would rule for centuries. It is in these moments, of arrival and resistance, of foreign fire and native endurance, that the Russian identity began to take form. Not from a single empire or tribe, but from a crucible of collisions. Mongol cavalry, Teutonic zeal, Viking seafarers, and Polish knights, all left their footprints on the snowy ground. By the late 15th century, the Mongol grip was loosening. In 1480, at the Great Stand on the Ugra River, the Russians, led by Ivan III of Moscow, refused to pay tribute. The Mongol forces turned back, and without a single arrow fired, the long chapter of foreign domination began to close. The invaders had come and gone, but the echoes of their presence remained. In architecture, in language, in military tactics, and in myth. Tonight, let us rest our minds on the still surface of the Ugra River, imagining the silent standoff that marked a nation's awakening. The foreign flames that once scorched the land had dimmed. The winds now whispered of unity and of empire. As the embers of Mongol dominance cooled in the late 15th century, a new fire was quietly kindling within the forests of Muscovy. Under the cautious but determined leadership of Ivan III, known to history as Ivan the Great, the Grand Duchy of Moscow began to rise, not just as a principality, but as a vision. A vision of unity, strength, and something far greater, an empire. It began with consolidation. Ivan the Great expanded Moscow's reach by absorbing rival principalities, often through strategic marriages or subtle coercion. The fragmented lands of Rus, once splintered and subservient, were brought under one banner. With each acquisition, the authority of Moscow grew, and the memory of Mongol subjugation faded. In 1480, with a quiet but decisive standoff at the Ugra River, Moscow effectively cast off Mongol rule. No great battle was needed, just the will to say no. This symbolic moment marked a turning point, the end of foreign domination and the beginning of imperial ambition. Ivan the Great also laid the foundations of Russia's future ideological identity. He took the title Tsar and married Sophia Paleologina, a Byzantine princess. With this union, the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome began to take root. Rome had fallen, Byzantium had crumbled, and now Moscow would carry the torch of Christian orthodoxy and imperial legacy. A new empire, ordained and divine, was being imagined. The vision gained terrifying clarity under his grandson, Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Crowned the first official Tsar of all Russia in 1547, Ivan IV was both reformer and tyrant. Early in his reign, he modernized the legal code, curbed the power of boyars, nobles, and expanded education and trade. But his reign would descend into paranoia, cruelty, and bloodshed. With the creation of the Oprichnina, a personal guard and secret police force, Ivan terrorized his own nobility, devastated entire cities, and ruled with an iron fist forged in fear. Yet even in his fury, Ivan expanded the realm. He pushed eastward, conquering the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, and opened the vast Volga River to Russian control. The path to Siberia, immense, frozen, and full of mystery, was now within reach. And so the great eastward push began. Cossack explorers and fur traders, driven by adventure and backed by imperial authority, crossed the Ural Mountains and ventured into Siberia. In the late 1500s, Under the leadership of Yermak Timofeyevich, they defeated the Khanate of Siberia and claimed new lands for the Tsar. Each year, the Russian frontier crept further east, through forests, rivers, tundra, and mountain. Wooden forts sprang up. Orthodox churches rose beneath northern lights. Tribes were absorbed, displaced, or converted. By the late 17th century, Russia had reached the Pacific Ocean, a staggering arc of empire stretching across 11 time zones. But Russia did not only look east. To the west and south, it clashed with powers both ancient and rising. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth proved a persistent rival. Wars were fought for borderlands and souls. Orthodox Slavs under Catholic rule became pawns in a wider religious and geopolitical game. In the 1600s, Moscow itself was invaded, occupied by Polish forces during a chaotic period known as the Time of Troubles. Yet from this crisis, a new dynasty emerged, the Romanovs, who would rule Russia for over 300 years. Under Peter the Great, the empire transformed again. Tall, bold, and obsessed with modernization, Peter looked to the west, not to conquer, but to learn. He traveled in disguise through European cities, studying shipbuilding, science, and governance. Upon his return, he brought sweeping changes, new industries, a standing army, and even a tax on beards. Most dramatically, he built a new capital, St. Petersburg, on the marshy shores of the Baltic. It was a window to the west, a symbol of imperial ambition crafted in stone and glass. Under Peter's rule, Russia defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, secured access to the sea, and declared itself an empire in 1721. His successors continued the expansion. Catherine the Great, Empress and enlightened autocrat, brought Crimea and parts of Poland under Russian control. She courted European philosophers while overseeing one of the largest territorial expansions in Russian history. Under her reign, the empire became a blend of Enlightenment ideals and absolute monarchy. But expansion came with costs. Native peoples of Siberia and Central Asia were colonized. National identities in Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Baltics were suppressed. While the empire grew outward, internal strains intensified. Serfdom deepened. Inequality widened. Still, the Russian Empire marched on. It stretched from the icy shores of the Arctic to the warm waters of the Black Sea. From the Carpathians to Kamchatka. From the forests of Finland to the deserts of Turkestan. By the 19th century, Russia had become the largest contiguous empire in the world. Its Tsars sat atop a throne of vastness, ruling a mosaic of cultures, languages, and landscapes. Yet beneath the weight of its own greatness, cracks had begun to form. But for now, let your thoughts drift across the empire's snowy fields and golden domes. Picture caravans moving across the steppe, sailing ships docking in St. Petersburg, and traders navigating frozen rivers under moonlit skies. The empire had risen, and for a time, it stood mighty and proud, draped in furs, crowned in gold, and lit by the faint glow of ambition and destiny. As mighty and expansive as the Russian Empire had become, its foundations were never as solid as they appeared. Beneath the glittering domes of St. Petersburg and the sweeping plains of Siberia, tensions simmered. Resistance, often silent but sometimes thunderous, wove through Russia's history like a shadow trailing its enormous stride. Let us now drift through the whispers of rebellion, of people who pushed back, quietly or boldly, against the weight of empire. We begin with the peasantry, the lifeblood of the empire and its most burdened class. Bound to the land through the chains of serfdom, millions of peasants lived under the control of wealthy landowners, with little hope for autonomy or dignity. Serfdom in Russia was not simply poverty, it was a near total loss of freedom, where generations toiled under the same masters and bore the same burdens, with little recourse. By the 17th century, uprisings began to erupt with greater intensity. The most famous of these early revolts was led by a Cossack named Stepan Razin. In 1670, he rallied a ragtag force of disgruntled peasants, runaway serfs, and Cossacks, launching a sweeping rebellion along the Volga River. His message was simple: justice and freedom for the oppressed. For a brief time, cities fell, nobles fled, and Razin was hailed as a hero of the downtrodden. But the rebellion was ultimately crushed, and Razin met a gruesome end, executed in Moscow, his body torn apart as a warning to others. But the fire did not die. In the 18th century, a towering figure emerged from the mist of discontent, Emelian Pugachev. Claiming to be the long-dead Tsar Peter III, Pugachev led the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Between 1773 and 1775, his forces captured towns, executed nobles, and spread panic throughout the empire's heartland. The Pugachev rebellion was fueled not just by economic suffering but by spiritual and ethnic grievances, especially among non-Russian groups like the Bashkirs and Tatars. Though brutally suppressed by Catherine the Great's army, Pugachev's rebellion left a permanent mark. It exposed the vulnerability of the empire and the dangerous depths of rural discontent. It was a cry from the soil, echoing in the ears of emperors and thinkers alike. Rebellion also took intellectual form. In the early 19th century, a new class began to emerge. Young Russian officers, many of whom had fought against Napoleon and returned with ideas of liberty and constitutional government. In 1825, a group of these idealists, known as the Decembrists, attempted to prevent the ascension of Tsar Nicholas I. On a cold December morning, they gathered in Senate Square in St. Petersburg, demanding a constitution and the end of autocracy. The rebellion was small and quickly put down, but its symbolism was profound. The Decembrists were hanged or exiled to Siberia, yet they became martyrs for a growing movement. A new age of resistance had begun, one shaped not only by swords, but by pens and ideas. Throughout the 19th century, revolutionary thought spread like wildfire. Secret societies formed. Radical writers like Alexander Herzen and later Fyodor Dostoevsky wrestled with questions of justice and reform. The government responded with censorship, exile, and surveillance, but the hunger for change could not be so easily quelled. By the late 1800s, a wave of populist and anarchist groups emerged. One such group, the People's Will, took resistance to its most explosive form. In 1881, they assassinated Tsar Alexander II, the very monarch who had freed the serfs 2 decades earlier. Though his reforms had earned him praise in some circles, others saw them as too little, too late. His death marked a turning point. The empire tightened its grip, but the opposition grew bolder. Among the oppressed were also ethnic minorities across the empire. In Poland, uprisings flared repeatedly throughout the 19th century. The Poles, with their own culture and identity, resisted Russification, the forced adoption of Russian language and customs. In the Caucasus, Muslim tribes resisted Russian incursions for decades, most notably under Imam Shamil, who led fierce guerrilla warfare in the 1830s and 1840s. Jews, too, faced brutal persecution under the empire. Pogroms, violent riots against Jewish communities, were common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Entire villages were burned. Families fled westward. Many emigrated, while others joined revolutionary causes, determined to fight back against the injustice that had followed them for generations. And then came the workers. By the early 20th century, industrialization had begun to reshape Russia. Massive factories rose in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, drawing peasants into urban slums and transforming them into laborers. Working conditions were grim: long hours, low pay, dangerous tasks. Labor strikes became frequent, and socialist ideas began to resonate among the working class. In 1905, frustration exploded. After peaceful protesters marching to deliver a petition to the Tsar were fired upon by imperial guards in what came to be known as Bloody Sunday, a wave of strikes, mutinies, and protests swept the country. Though the Tsar made some concessions, creating a parliament called the Duma, the monarchy remained largely autocratic. Still, the seed had been planted. For centuries, Russia had stretched itself across continents and cultures, projecting power and pride. But beneath its grandeur, people whispered of freedom, plotted change, and sometimes screamed their resistance aloud. So now, in the hush of night, picture the snowy streets of St. Petersburg, where students pass secret pamphlets from hand to hand. Imagine the distant crackle of gunfire along the Volga, where peasants raise their tools in rebellion. Feel the weight of chains on calloused wrists, and the courage it takes to break them. For all its might, Russia's empire was never unchallenged. Its story is not only one of conquest, but also of the countless voices who dared to rise, to speak, and to dream of something different. As the winds of history swept across the vast Russian landscape, there came moments so profound that they shifted the very course of the nation's destiny. In these turning points, quiet or cataclysmic, we find the beats of a nation's great transformation. Russia, ever immense and often tumultuous, has pivoted on the edge of collapse, reformation, and revolution more than once. Let us begin with one of the most dramatic shifts in Russian history, the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. For centuries, serfdom had tethered millions to the land, bound in a near-feudal relationship with the nobility. Then came Tsar Alexander II, the so-called Tsar Liberator. With a stroke of imperial will, he freed over 23 million serfs, offering them legal rights, the ability to own property, and theoretically, a new path in life. But the emancipation was only partial. The newly freed peasants received land, but often had to buy it at inflated prices, burdening them with debt. Nonetheless, it marked the beginning of modern Russian reform and a slow unraveling of the old feudal order. It was a bold leap forward, but one that left many still yearning for more. A second profound turning point arrived in 1905, when the seeds of revolution blossomed into a national crisis. Following Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, domestic unrest exploded. On Bloody Sunday, peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace, only to be met with bullets. Hundreds died. In the aftermath, a wave of strikes and protests forced the Tsar to create the Duma, a national parliament. Though the reforms were limited and often walked back, 1905 cracked open the shell of absolute monarchy. The people had spoken, and though the voice was suppressed, it would return, louder than before. Then came 1917, a year of such seismic upheaval that it shattered the imperial order completely. That February, amid food shortages, war fatigue, and industrial strikes, mass protests erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers joined the demonstrators. The Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated. After over 300 years, the Romanov dynasty collapsed. A provisional government took over, promising democratic reforms. But this new government faltered, still committed to continuing Russia's involvement in World War I, still unable to meet the needs of the people. Into this void stepped the Bolsheviks, a radical socialist faction led by Vladimir Lenin. On a chilly October night, according to the Julian calendar still used in Russia, they staged a near-bloodless coup and seized power. Thus began the Russian Revolution, a moment so profound it didn't just change Russia, it shook the entire world. The Bolsheviks pulled Russia out of the war. They promised peace, land, and bread. They abolished the old aristocracy, nationalized industry, and began constructing a new society. But not all welcomed the revolution. Civil war erupted between the Red Army, Bolsheviks, and the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, capitalists, and foreign powers. It was brutal. It was bloody. And it left scars that would last generations. By 1922, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, was born. Russia was no longer an empire. It was now the nucleus of a new, ideologically driven federation that aimed to reshape humanity itself. Another immense turning point loomed in the 1930s, under the rule of Joseph Stalin. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin consolidated power, and the Soviet Union changed again, this time into a totalitarian state marked by intense surveillance, repression, and central planning. In a ruthless campaign to modernize agriculture, Stalin launched collectivization, forcing peasants into state-run farms. Resistance was crushed, crops failed, and millions died in the resulting famine, especially in Ukraine, an event known as the Holodomor. At the same time, Stalin initiated the Great Purge, where suspected dissenters, real or imagined, were arrested, executed, or sent to gulags in Siberia. Millions vanished into the machinery of terror. And yet, amidst this oppression, the Soviet Union industrialized at a staggering rate, turning from a largely agrarian society into a global power. Then came World War II, or as Russians call it, the Great Patriotic War. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in a devastating surprise attack. Cities burned. Villages were razed. But the Soviet people rallied with astonishing resolve. Turning points during the war were many, but perhaps none more powerful than the Battle of Stalingrad. Fought between 1942 and 1943, it was one of the bloodiest battles in history. The Soviets refused to surrender. Street by street, floor by floor, they fought. And eventually, they won. The tide of war turned. The Red Army pushed westward, liberating Eastern Europe and eventually capturing Berlin in 1945. The Soviet Union emerged victorious, but at a terrible cost. Over 20 million Soviet citizens dead, entire cities reduced to rubble. In the war's aftermath, another pivotal moment unfolded, the dawn of the Cold War. The Soviet Union became a superpower, locked in ideological and political rivalry with the United States. The world teetered between capitalism and communism, with nuclear weapons casting an ever-present shadow. Under leaders like Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, and later Mikhail Gorbachev, the USSR underwent phases of both repression and reform. Gorbachev's introduction of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, in the 1980s was a final attempt to modernize the system. But the center could not hold. And so, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Quietly, almost shockingly. After nearly 70 years, the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin. Russia emerged once more as an independent nation, stunned and uncertain, yet stepping into a new era. From Tsars to Commissars, from revolutions to restorations, these turning points were not just historical bookmarks. They were the tectonic shifts that reshaped a people's path. In the vast tapestry of Russia's history, it is not only the rulers, revolutions, and wars that shaped the soul of the nation, but the voices of its people. From poets to peasants, mystics to mothers, their stories echo through time like whispers on the wind, delicate and powerful. Let us begin long ago, in the countryside, where for centuries the rhythms of daily life were etched in the soil. Russian peasants, mujiks, labored under harsh conditions, yet their folk songs told tales of love, struggle, and the beauty of the land. They sang lullabies to cradle their children and funeral laments to honor the departed. Their voices, passed through generations, carried the heartbeat of a people who endured. Even in the shadow of Tsars and tyrants, artists emerged, dreamers who dared to speak truths too dangerous to shout aloud. One of the earliest was Alexander Pushkin, a literary giant whose poetry blended African ancestry, French education, and deep Russian roots. His verse gave dignity to everyday language, becoming the cornerstone of modern Russian literature. In Pushkin's rhymes, we hear the optimism and melancholy of a nation divided between progress and repression. Then came Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose novels, dark, complex, and haunting, explored the depths of the human soul. In Crime and Punishment, he gave voice to guilt, redemption, and the torments of conscience. His characters were not just fictional, they were reflections of a society grappling with poverty, inequality, and existential despair. Next, the defiant songs of revolution. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, workers in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow began to organize. Factory conditions were brutal, wages were low. Leaflets were passed in secret. Protest songs echoed in narrow alleys. One voice rising above the rest was that of the common worker, who demanded dignity, bread, and peace. During the Soviet years, the state declared that the people were now in power, but their voices were often silenced. Still, some spoke out in powerful, quiet ways. The poet Anna Akhmatova lived through revolutions, 2 world wars, and Stalin's purges. When her son was imprisoned, she waited outside the prison gates with hundreds of other mothers. In whispered poems memorized by friends, Akhmatova captured the sorrow of a generation. She wrote not for the state, but for the soul. "Can you describe this?" a woman once asked her, standing outside a prison. "Yes," Akhmatova replied, "I can." Then came Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a soldier turned prisoner who spent years in the Siberian gulags. His writings, smuggled out of the camps, exposed the brutal reality of life under Stalin. In the Gulag archipelago, Solzhenitsyn became a voice for millions who could not speak. He reminded the world that beneath every uniform there was a human being, and that truth, even in darkness, has power. In music, too, the people found a way to express themselves. During the late Soviet years, bard singers like Vladimir Vysotsky performed gritty, poetic songs about injustice, absurdity, and love. His raspy voice, never officially sanctioned, was passed around on tape cassettes, shared in kitchens and back rooms. Vysotsky's fans knew the rules, but they sang with him anyway. And in the rural villages, the babushkas, Russian grandmothers, kept ancient traditions alive. Through embroidery, cooking, and storytelling, they preserved folk wisdom that had survived wars, famines, and regime changes. Around warm stoves, they told fairy tales of firebirds, wise fools, and magical forests. These stories, though simple, carried moral lessons and ancestral truths. In modern Russia, new voices have emerged, those of youth, artists, and activists. Journalists like Anna Politkovskaya gave voice to the voiceless, reporting on the Chechen wars with compassion and courage. Her work cost her her life, but her legacy lives on in every story that challenges power. On the internet, Russian bloggers and filmmakers, dancers and satirists now find creative ways to speak out. They make memes, music videos, and documentaries that question the official narrative. In cities and remote towns, the pulse of public expression beats anew, sometimes in code, sometimes in plain sight. Not all voices shout. Some whisper. Some are silenced. But still they linger. The Russian people have faced immense trials, famine, invasion, repression, but they have also birthed music of staggering beauty, literature of profound insight, and traditions that bind generations together. In every lullaby hummed in a snowy cottage, in every poem scratched into a prison wall, and in every quiet act of defiance, the soul of Russia speaks. And so tonight, as you drift deeper into slumber, imagine a poet writing by candlelight, a grandmother humming a tune from her childhood, a child scribbling a dream on a frost-covered window. These are the true architects of a nation, the unseen, the unheard, the eternal. The people's voices, once whispered, now carry through time. And they are still speaking. As Russia emerged from the long shadow of the Soviet Union, the dawn of the modern era arrived with both hope and hardship. The red banners came down, the hammers and sickles disappeared from the skyline, and the country stood at a vast crossroads, unsure of the path ahead. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was seismic, politically, economically, and emotionally. One moment, Russia was part of a superpower, and the next, it was thrust into uncertain independence, accompanied by 13 other former Soviet republics. Moscow, once the center of a sprawling socialist experiment, now faced the dizzying transition to capitalism. It was a time of confusion, of chaos, and for many, of loss. The 1990s were marked by economic collapse. Inflation skyrocketed. Life savings evaporated. Long queues formed outside empty stores. Factories closed, pensions went unpaid, and entire communities were thrown into poverty. For the elderly, it felt as if everything they had known was crumbling. For the young, it was a time of wild change, and often danger. The rise of oligarchs, ultra-wealthy businessmen who gained control over vast swaths of Russia's resources, became one of the defining features of the era. Through a series of privatization deals, state industries like oil, gas, and steel ended up in the hands of a few. A new class of billionaires emerged seemingly overnight, building lavish mansions while millions went hungry. The contrast was stark. The wounds, deep. Crime surged. In cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the newly unshackled black market gave rise to mafia groups who operated with impunity. Gang wars flared. Bribery and corruption became widespread. Russia's soul, long tied to communal struggle and sacrifice, now wrestled with greed and inequality. And yet, amid the struggle, something stirred. New voices emerged, entrepreneurs, musicians, independent journalists, who tried to make sense of the new Russia. Youth culture began to evolve, blending Russian tradition with global trends. Russian rock bands sang about disillusionment, love, and identity. In cluttered art studios and underground clubs, people searched for meaning in a shifting world. Then came the turn of the millennium, and with it, the rise of a new leader, Vladimir Putin. A former KGB officer with a calm, steely demeanor, Putin took office in 1999 promising stability. For many Russians, weary of the chaos of the 1990s, he delivered just that. Under Putin, the state regained control over key industries, and the economy began to recover. Cities modernized. Infrastructure improved. Moscow glittered with new skyscrapers, high-speed trains, and shopping centers. For some, life began to feel normal again, even prosperous. But this return to order came at a cost. Political opposition was silenced. Independent media outlets were shut down or brought under state control. Protesters were arrested. New laws restricted dissent. The same state that had once collapsed from overreach now flexed its power again, drawing red lines around free expression. In the 2000s and 2010s, Russia became increasingly assertive on the world stage. Conflicts in Chechnya, Georgia, and later Ukraine revealed tensions between Russia and the West. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, sparking global condemnation and economic sanctions. National pride soared among many Russians, but so too did international isolation. The people, once again, found themselves caught between the promises of greatness and the realities of hardship. Sanctions strained the economy. Prices rose. Jobs disappeared. And yet, through it all, ordinary Russians endured, just as they always had. There were moments of protest. In the streets of Moscow and beyond, young people marched with signs demanding fair elections, transparency, and human rights. These gatherings, though often suppressed, signaled that not all voices had gone quiet. Technology, especially social media, gave many a platform to speak, even if only in whispers. Environmental concerns also stirred movements. The vast Siberian wilderness, long a source of national pride, faced threats from deforestation, pollution, and industrial exploitation. Local activists and indigenous communities began raising their voices in defense of the land, echoing ancient connections to nature and homeland. Then came global challenges, pandemics, economic downturns, and the ever-present tension between old loyalties and new realities. In recent years, war returned to the region with renewed intensity, further deepening Russia's struggle for identity, sovereignty, and survival on the world stage. And yet, in village markets, in snowy forests, in crowded apartments, and quiet cafes, life goes on. Children still laugh in playgrounds. Artists still paint. Grandmothers still bake blini and pass down stories. The Russian people, so often pressed by history, continue to rise, adapt, and endure. This is the essence of Russia's modern struggle, a search for balance between past and present, strength and openness, tradition and innovation. The journey is far from over. And so, as you let your thoughts drift like snowflakes over a sleeping tundra, remember that even in the coldest of winters, the Russian spirit burns warm. In silence, in resilience, and in the quiet dignity of its people, modern Russia finds its way forward. Stretching across 2 continents and 11 time zones, Russia today remains the world's largest country, an immense land of contrasts and quiet wonders. From the Baltic Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, it is a nation where frozen tundra meets blooming cherry orchards, where Soviet monuments share space with Orthodox domes, and where the past lingers like mist over a sprawling, enigmatic landscape. In the cities, Russia hums with the rhythm of modern life. Moscow, the capital, stands as a monument to ambition. Its skyline pierces the clouds with glass towers, while beneath the streets, one of the world's most ornate metro systems glides silently through marble corridors lit by chandeliers. In Red Square, the candy-colored onion domes of St. Basil's Cathedral dazzle like a dream, a beacon of history that has watched centuries unfold. St. Petersburg, to the north, is often called the cultural heart of Russia. With its grand canals, gilded theaters, and pastel-colored palaces, it feels like a city caught between Europe and something uniquely Slavic. The Hermitage Museum, housed in the opulent Winter Palace, holds one of the largest collections of art on earth, a treasure chest where Da Vinci and Rembrandt hang in quiet conversation. Beyond the cities, Russia reveals its soul in vast, untamed spaces. The Siberian taiga stretches like a green ocean, home to wolves, bears, and elusive snow leopards. In winter, it slumbers under a heavy quilt of snow, its silence broken only by the rustle of trees or the distant call of a raven. In summer, wildflowers burst from the earth, and the air is thick with the scent of pine and promise. To the south, the Caucasus Mountains rise in jagged defiance, their peaks dusted with snow even in the warmest months. In their shadows lie ancient villages where traditions endure and songs echo across stone valleys. Nearby, the Black Sea laps gently against pebbled shores where travelers bask in the sun and sip tea beneath grapevines. In the Far East, the Kamchatka Peninsula brims with volcanic power. Geysers hiss from the ground, and steaming craters bubble in the snow. Bears fish lazily in salmon-choked rivers, and the northern lights dance above like celestial brushstrokes painting the sky. It is a place both wild and magical, remote and fiercely alive. Across the nation, people move with quiet determination. They ride trains that snake across the continent, the famous Trans-Siberian Railway offering a slow, thoughtful journey through forests, steppes, and cities old and new. In rural areas, wooden dachas with lace-like carvings line the roads, their gardens bursting with cucumbers, dill, and stories whispered over steaming mugs of tea. Culturally, Russia is alive with expression. Ballet companies, orchestras, and theater troupes keep the artistic spirit ablaze, while contemporary musicians and filmmakers add new chapters to the country's creative legacy. Russian literature still holds its revered place, with names like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pushkin woven into everyday conversations, classroom lessons, and nighttime reflections. Spirituality, too, has experienced a quiet revival. In golden-lit cathedrals and roadside chapels, candles flicker beside icons of saints, and chants rise gently into vaulted ceilings. Pilgrims and tourists alike visit ancient monasteries that rest on forested lochshores, surrounded by stillness. In the markets, life unfolds in laughter and color. Babushkas sell homemade jams and pickles beside fresh bread and wild honey. Children tug at parents' coats, begging for sweets. Vendors call out their prices while samovars hiss with hot tea. It is in these ordinary moments that the pulse of the country can truly be felt, resilient, grounded, and human. Technology continues to expand its reach. In tech hubs from Kazan to Novosibirsk, engineers and developers work on innovations in medicine, space travel, and artificial intelligence. Meanwhile, bloggers and YouTubers broadcast daily life from snowy neighborhoods or high-rise balconies, giving the world a peek into modern Russian living. Yet life in Russia today is not without its complexities. Political tensions linger. Economic disparities persist between urban centers and rural regions. In some places, freedom of expression remains a delicate balance. But through it all, the people carry on, weathering storms, celebrating small victories, and finding beauty in everyday things. The seasons still dictate much of the rhythm of life. Winter arrives with deep snow, warm fur coats, and windows glowing gold against the chill. Spring brings renewal, melting ice, budding trees, and the songs of birds returning home. Summer stretches long and golden, while autumn drapes the birch forests in amber and rust. In all its immensity, Russia today is more than a country. It is an experience, a living memory, a land where the past is never far behind, but the future is always pushing forward. So, as you drift deeper into rest, picture this vast and layered land, rivers winding like silver threads through sleepy forests, quiet cities with their timeless domes, and the ever-present hush of snow falling in the dark. Here, in the hush of night, the land of Russia breathes, endures, and dreams. As the stars twinkle over Siberian forests and the moonlight glides across the rooftops of Moscow, Russia dreams, just as it always has. A country with a history carved in both triumph and tragedy now turns its gaze to the future, full of questions, full of hope. In this immense land, tomorrow begins in many forms. It begins in classrooms, where children memorize Pushkin's poetry and imagine what kind of world they will help shape. It begins in laboratories and libraries, on farms and factory floors, in small towns tucked beneath snowy hills, and in high-rise apartments in bustling cities. The future of Russia is not written by monuments or empires, it is whispered quietly by the dreams of its people. There is hope in the young generation, who straddle the weight of the past and the promises of progress. They code software in Novosibirsk, paint murals on the alleys of St. Petersburg, and launch startups from kitchen tables in Kazan. Many speak multiple languages, see the world through wide-open eyes, and wish to bridge divides rather than deepen them. They carry with them the resilience of their ancestors and the yearning for something kinder, freer, and more just. Russia's artists, always its soul, continue to find new ways to tell stories. Theater blossoms in unexpected places. Music fuses tradition with innovation, balalaikas alongside bass guitars, folk tales retold through modern dance. Writers explore identity and memory, while filmmakers explore the complexities of post-Soviet life. The creative spirit, once confined and censored, finds new outlets, slowly expanding like spring thaw. Nature, too, figures into Russia's hopes. As climate challenges emerge, there is growing awareness of the need to protect the country's vast forests, delicate Arctic zones, and countless rivers and lakes. Environmental activists plant trees, clean up coastlines, and call for more sustainable futures. There is a quiet but growing movement to live in harmony with the land that has nurtured this civilization for millennia. In the realm of space, Russia still dreams boldly. With a legacy that stretches back to Sputnik and Gagarin, there are hopes of returning to the moon, of partnering with other nations for peaceful exploration, and of inspiring a new generation of stargazers and scientists. Rural communities, long overlooked, are beginning to find new life. In villages once forgotten, there are festivals returning, crafts revived, and young families moving back with dreams of slower, more rooted living. In regions like Altai and Karelia, ecotourism brings visitors seeking not luxury, but authenticity and connection. Politically, the road ahead is winding. Many yearn for deeper dialogue, for voices to be heard without fear, for a society that values both its traditions and its freedoms. Across kitchen tables and online forums, people debate, reflect, and imagine better ways forward. Though challenges remain, hope persists, in quiet conversations, in brave journalism, and in the belief that every empire, no matter how vast, must one day answer to the people. Internationally, there are glimmers of renewed connection. Artists collaborate across borders. Scientists share discoveries. Athletes compete and shake hands. Diplomats, despite their differences, still meet in hopes of finding common ground. In a world ever more entwined, Russia's path will always touch the lives of others. Perhaps most of all, Russia's future lies in its capacity for memory and renewal. This is a nation that has survived revolutions, invasions, collapses, and rebirths. Each time, it has gathered its strength, drawn from its deep well of culture, and imagined a new beginning. So tonight, as we near the end of our journey, let us leave Russia with this image. A young girl on a snowy Moscow street, bundled in a coat, her breath visible in the air, looking up at the stars. She doesn't yet know where life will take her, but she holds a book under her arm and hope in her heart. Around her, the city lights twinkle like constellations, each window a story, each street a thread in a much larger tapestry. Russia, vast and intricate, solemn and soulful, ancient and young all at once, stands at the edge of tomorrow, not in haste, but in quiet contemplation. And just as its rivers flow ever forward, so too will its people. As you rest now, let the dream of this enduring land carry you. Through forests and cathedrals, poems and lullabies, may the spirit of Russia's past and the promise of its future gently guide you into peaceful sleep. Good night.